There are places in this world that humanity was never supposed to see, walled in by mountains of burning black rock, isolated by a choking canopy of poison flora, woods where tooth, claw, and hunger still sit atop the food chain. Long before our kind ever set foot in these mountains, when the peaks of the Blue Ridge towered above the stars, and the hearts of the plateau still rolled with ridges tough as pine knobs, darkness was brought here in cages made of fear. Our tongues do not have the shape to speak the true names of what they are, and that's are, not were. They are hunger, consumption, lust, all the things that settle under the heart and below the ribcage. They are the cancer that will one day eat the edges of this universe and leave nothing in its place. They are not evil. They are not of hell or the Christian devil. They simply are. Hey everyone, thanks for sitting through that little opening. Today we're talking about the Old Gods of Appalachia, the role-playing game, as well as a little bit of the podcast. But thus opens the Old Gods of Appalachia podcast, an Eldritch Horror anthology podcast created by Steve Shell and Cam Collins. It began in 2019 and has, in the last 4 years, grown into a highly popular story podcast. The setting is an alternate 1900s Appalachia, where where the dark is darker and green is greener, where eldritch horrors run as deep as the coal veins under the ground. The RPG was developed with the help of Steve Shell and Cam Collins, but admitted on page 6, had to make some necessary changes in order to make it playable for you and I. And therefore, there are some differences between the podcast and the rules of this game. But they did say that you should kind of consider it your own version, a semi-fan fiction, as it were, of the podcast. But anyway, let's get into it. So it's 418 pages. It just came out. It's 418 pages, but considering that some of those pages are the covers, we're talking more about 416 pages, of which 112 are dedicated to character creation, which is really daunting, but is not really that bad. It's pretty typical for Monte Cook Games, who made this book, and their Cypher System, to have these sort of long character creations, but the reason is because they kind of explain the game rules as you're going through the character creation. Like, they're talking about these various different aspects, but they also use some of that time to tell you how these things work. So unlike some games where you kind of jump to like how to play the game before you go to character creation, which is sometimes a thing, in this case you're kind of figuring that out or finding out how you're supposed to use these aspects as you go. However, that sort of leads to this problem that Monte Cook Games has, and this book definitely has it, where there's some repetition or repetitious information, which I think could streamline the book and thus shrink it if they didn't do that, but they do. But anyway, character creation is 112 pages, whereas the world lore is only 85 pages, which should tell you something about kind of that whole thing with Monte Cook Games and their character creation. But the remaining 219 pages is for game rules, gear stats, monster stats, and adventures. So it's not too bad. It was just kind of daunting in the beginning to think, oh man, that's a lot of pages for character creation, but it's okay. So let's talk about this game and its system and the character creation and all of that, as I usually do. So the themes of Old Gods of Appalachia, if you couldn't tell by that little intro I did, it's really horror and the conflict between eldritch things and the good people of the area of Appalachia. There are essentially two mystical forces in the world, and that is the green and the dark. Those are the two things. The green is sort of nature, and the dark is sort of anti-nature or evil, but not really evil, because sometimes they're opposed to each other, and sometimes they actually work together, thus creating a mixture of possible stories that kind of go on in the podcast, but also in the game that you're running. I mean, the green could be the good guy or the bad guy, depending on how it's going down. But essentially the themes are like hope, heart, and loss. There's a lot of stuff going on, but everyone is kind of being put down by large corporations of coal mining factories and stuff. And those are sometimes run by people who are in league with the dark and sometimes not. And then there's also people who seem like they might be of the green, but actually turn out to be something else. It's essentially that there's like deep things really deep that are the Eldritch Horrors. Then there's the sort of middle things, which are like their servitors that are kind of out there that interact with people and are still very powerful. And so they're like the higher type monsters. And then you've got the like lower things, which are unnatural things that do exist and kind of interact with people all the time. The kinds of stuff that we hear about from like Appalachian folklore and stuff. But it's a Monte Cook game, like I said before. It bases itself off the Cypher System, which becomes very apparent as you read the book because it brings up the Cypher System like dozens of times in the rules. So you're kind of reading a Cypher System sort of rule book with Old Gods of Appalachia kind of bolted on top, but that's typical. And that was a design decision they made when they decided to partner up with Monte Cook Games, so I'm not going to blame them for that. But the Old Gods of Appalachia is developed by Monte Cook Games and thus uses their Cypher System. If you don't know anything about the Cypher System, essentially the core mechanic is a sliding scale of difficulty. They use the system that, like, whenever a character takes an action, the game master has to determine the difficulty of that action, whether it's between 0 and 10. 0 meaning that there's no need to make a roll. You just do the thing, whatever it is. Maybe you're really good at it, or maybe the game master just doesn't care, or the outcome really doesn't mean anything. Like, the outcome isn't something that has like a potential failure loss cost, so there's no reason to put anything on it. But for every difficulty that's 1 or above, you're going to have to roll a d20. The difficulty of 1 does not mean that you have to roll above a 1. In fact, it actually means 3. The difficulty ratings are 3 times whatever that difficulty rating number is. So a 1 is 3, a 2 is 6, and so on. And so you just roll the d20 and try to get above that number. But the reason I said sliding scale is because that difficulty can fluctuate up or down depending on certain circumstances or things they call assets. There's also skills, but if you look at it, if you're paying attention, they're the same as an asset. An asset technically is an item, but it also is the way that the skills work. Everything all works the same. So basically, assets or hindrances is essentially what it boils down to. Assets can be anything from skill training, from assistance, from special abilities, from items or conditions. That's why I said they're all kind of the same, because while they are a little bit distinguished differently in the book, when you actually break down what they do, they're all the same category. So I just call them assets for ease of you understanding. If you don't have an asset to drop down the difficulty, then it either stays wherever it is or there's a hindrance, and that's the reason you don't have an asset. Hindrance means that you actually bump it up. So the assets, when they lower them down, it's called easing. And there's a couple of ways to ease. There's those assets, but then there's also effort, which is another thing we'll get into. So, for example, a character may try to jump a 10-foot gap, which the book indicates is a difficulty rating of 4 at its base. So a 10-foot gap jump is 4, right? So means that the player has to roll a 12 on the d20 or above to succeed on jumping the gap. So in order to lessen that difficulty, the player might decide to do something like take a running start. And the game master might say, that sounds fine, I'll go ahead and give that to you. So you'll ease the difficulty down to 3. So now they have to get a 9, not a 12 on the roll. Well, the player might also decide that they want to apply something called effort. That's where they're actually the character's putting some effort into trying to get it done. And by doing so, they reduce one of their pools, which we'll cover in a little bit, down, which is probably going to be might, potentially speed in this case for jumping over this cliff. They're gonna spend some of those points from their pool to 3, as a matter of fact, to drop it down again. So they're easing the difficulty scale down again. So now they're dropping it down to 2, which means now they only have to roll a 6 or higher on the d20 to succeed, which is a lot easier to succeed than 12, right? It's half as hard. So that's sort of the key concept of how the difficulty system works in the Cypher System. But one other key aspect of the Cypher System and why it's called the Cypher System is ciphers. And ciphers are a single-use item that produces a special effect. Now, it could be a magical-like effect, it could be a high-tech effect, it could be a skill-like effect, but essentially, they're just this effect that happens. And for Old Gods of Appalachia, the way that they applied that is they might as well be semi-supernatural things. These are witch jars or snake bite oil or some other thing, and that's how they represent them in old Gods of Appalachia, like hagstone, some other kind of folky magic thing. And they're intended to be found and used throughout the adventure. It's not just in Old Gods of Appalachia, but in general for the Cypher System. The idea is that as people are exploring and looking around the world, they uncover these ciphers. They're single use, and so therefore they should use them. But they also have this sort of balancing mechanism to determine, like, the sort of push the players into using them, and that is that you can only have so many before they start having weird effects. Maybe they cancel each other out, maybe they nullify each other's abilities, maybe they just explode in a terrible, horrible way. But they create this sort of thing where you only want to have 2 or 3 of them, depending on what your character can sort of hold, or any bags that they have that might have pockets for them or something. So they only hold so many on their person before weird stuff starts happening. So that's basically the whole system at its core. But knowing that it's a Cypher system, we can already look at the Old Gods of Appalachia and know that the heart of the game is exploration and not conflict. Because you're supposed to go out and find these ciphers, you're supposed to use them, then the game is mostly going to be out exploring, doing things in the world, investigating. And experience in the Cypher system is not gained through combat. It's not gained through downing enemies and doing stuff like that. It's gained through the GM creating difficulty for players as they're going out and doing things, which is called a GM intrusion. So this game is going to use that. So we know that in advance, before I even cracked open the book, that we were going to be talking about ciphers and GM intrusions. So players in the Cypher system, and this is clear in the book, players do all of the rolling because of that. So the players are doing the things, whatever they want to do. They're walking around, they're looking into stuff, they're investigating, they're trying to find whatever, and the GM intrudes on that situation. So the GM's deal is to just make interesting plot points. So there's not a lot of rolling the GM has to do. In fact, the only rolling the GM might do would be rolling on a random table to figure out something, how to do an intrusion or something. But a lot of times, even that is done by the players, and it's based on the player's die roll when they did an action rather than the GM rolling a d6 or something. But that's how it goes. And also knowing that it's a Cypher system, and this is what is clear in the book, it uses the stat pools of might, speed, and intellect. And they represent your character stats, but realistically they represent a pool of points that the character can use whenever they're doing stuff. On that same note, attacks against the character also go after those pools. So certain types of attacks will attack a specific pool, or they'll just attack your might pool. So these pools are also your health. Which makes it really interesting because you're going to try to use these pools to apply effort, which is essentially the same as stabbing yourself, or you can get stabbed by somebody. So these pools have this sort of movement that goes on. Fortunately, they allow for rests and things. In fact, you can do 4 rests in a game day to be able to restore those. And the amount that you restore is essentially a d6 plus your tier, which is their levels, is how much you can restore each time you rest. And these rests have a little bit of variable time between them. The first one can happen instantaneously whenever you want. The second one has to happen, takes about 10 minutes. The next one's about an hour, and then the last one is several hours, right? So you can do 4, but it sort of slows the gameplay as you get the later on in those rests during a game day. But at the next game day, it resets. But players use these pools for effort and for other things, for easing essentially. And so as they go down, as these pools go down, players have to rely more on the items that they have on the ciphers, you see, instead of relying on their character's effort. Because, if you use a bunch of your effort right in the beginning to like climb a cliff, and then at the very top you find some person that wants to stab you, some ninja, what are you going to do? You used a lot of that pool just to get up that cliff. So you rely on your items instead of your pool sometimes. Or, if you have an item that may pertain to this, maybe you have a jar of spider climb or something, right? Just as an example. Then you can climb that cliff without needing to use your pool so that you'll have it when you get to the top. And this is sort of how the game goes. Now, normally I discuss combat at a different time, but I've already kind of discussed it now. Combat is exactly the same as any other action. You're climbing a cliff or you're getting stabbed. Those are both going to go after your pool. And usually there's the difficulty based on the thing you're trying to attack, just like there's difficulty for the actions you're going to take. So the one strong point of the Cypher system is that everything is the same. So there's no weird differences between whether you're attacking somebody or you're trying to put together a jar of stuff to scare away ghosts, right? It's all the same. So just like that, just like in that, you have difficulty for the enemy you're going to stab. And so that's going to be like a 7, a 6, a 5, or whatever. And then you try to use your effort or your ciphers or whatever to ease that down. And then you make your D20 roll. And if you're successful, you cause damage to your target. That's it. It's very simple. If you fail, then you missed. And then they attack you, but because the GM doesn't do any rolling, you have to roll for defense. And so it's the same difficulty as if you were trying to stab them, and then the same kind of thing happens, where if they hit you, then they'll do a certain amount of damage to your pool. Very, very simple system. So that's why I didn't separate the combat. Usually it's a whole different category of stuff, but it's all the same. So as you can see, the characters' pools will go down as they do things and they explore and they fight, and then as they rest, they come back. It's all the same thing in the Cypher system. It's straightforward. The GMs can focus on storytelling and the events happening in the world and how to intrude on the story. So in Old Gods of Appalachia, you can spend a lot of time thinking about where the Haints, Beasts, Grey Ladies, or whatever are going to go, or whenever they're going to appear in the story, what they're doing. Maybe they're trying to get their hands on moon jars or moon shards or memory jars or some other kind of magical related thing out there in the Appalachian holler, right? They're in the holler. And so you can focus on those things. It's a very interesting system and a very good system, but it is not my favorite system. I don't think it's bad. And I don't think anyone who likes it is crazy. I think it just kind of sticks me sometimes that it's like the XP is tied directly to how creative the GM is being and thinking of interesting ways to intrude in the story. Now, there is a caveat that if anyone rolls a 1 on their D20 roll, then the GM intrudes at that point and creates difficulty for the player. So it's not always just up to the GM. There are some mechanical times, but it actually still has the recommendation in this book and on Monte Cook's website in general that you're not going to intrude more than like 4 times in a game. So it's kind of a weird thing because the game master has to go create the really interesting, cool story, which includes, complications and barriers to the players getting something done. But then they also have to insert themselves in what's happening every now and then in order for the players to gain experience points, which they need to develop their character. So that's the only reason why it's not my favorite system. Otherwise, it's great. Otherwise, it's perfectly fine. So there's that. So let's get into character creation. So there are 3 chapters dedicated to character creation in Old Gods of Appalachia. I think it's really daunting for a new player to come into a role-playing game. If they've never played role-playing games before, this is their first time encountering the Cypher system, it can be fairly daunting. But it's actually really easy once you get through it, once you read the stuff. It makes sense. So I'll break it down for you to make it easier. Old Gods of Appalachia follows the character creation structure in the Cypher system where you're basically trying to create your character in one sentence. You're forming a sentence that is like, I am an adjective, noun, who, verbs. That's how they do it. And those things are different aspects of your character. So the adjective is called your character's descriptor. Your noun is the type of character that you are, and it's where a lot of your stuff comes from. And the verb is what's called the focus of your character. So I am a descriptor, type, who focuses on something. And that's how you build your character. It's going to be those 3 things. So you might say something like, I am a charming preacher who serves the green, right? Or I am a neighborly healer who walks in these woods. And those aren't just random examples. I actually made those characters, so I use them for you. And there'll be a link in this YouTube on the bottom there to see what that looked like when I finally made them. What's interesting is that even though your I am blank sentence starts with the descriptor and then goes type and focus, character creation starts with type because choosing the type is the easiest part of figuring out which character is. They explain it as just like the noun is the core of the sentence, so is the type of your character the noun or the focus of your character, right? So it's like that's kind of what they're saying. So in Old Gods of Appalachia, there are only 4 types of characters. There's only 4. But they have sort of sub-descriptors for those things. So the 4 are Protector, Sage, Explorer, and Speaker. But just because you're a Protector doesn't mean you're actually a Protector. You could be a Miner or a Forester or a Sheriff or some other thing, but at your core, you're a Protector. Sage, Explorer, and Speaker have the same thing, like Preacher, that charming preacher. Preacher is a sub identifier for the speaker category, and a healer is a sub identifier for the sage category, right? So that's kind of how it goes. These have those identities, and then they determine for your character the starting pools that you have, and then you manipulate them with 6 points. So you'll have a starting pool set based on your type, and then you manipulate them as you choose. They have background suggestions for you. They've actually got, I think, 20 of them or something for each of the types, and then you can manipulate those however you want. They've got your effort limit, which is basically 1 for every starting character, but then it changes as you level up in tiers. And then how many ciphers your character can have when they on their body or on their person and before they start interacting with each other. So it'll say you can have 2, or you can have 3, or you can have 4 if you're really good, that kind of thing. It gives you some area knowledge based on the type of character you are, the types of weapons you have like competency in and therefore should use, and things that you don't have competency in. Those incompetencies which are called inabilities, would actually hinder you if you try to use them. So if you're good with light weapons, say, and you try to use a medium weapon, it's going to actually make the difficulty 1 more instead of helping you in any way that goes 1 less. And then it also talks about your magical competency, because in Old Gods of Appalachia, magic is everywhere and it's part of the whole thing. And then it gives you your starting equipment, which is really just a vague, you get 2 of these, and 2 of those, and maybe this special thing. And then it also gives you pages of special abilities that are particular to your type, and that's where you actually get to choose the special abilities of the character. As a starting character, you get 3 or 4 depending on what type you are. 4, if, like speaker, the preacher has 4 options. They get to take 4 at character creation, whereas the sage gets 3. But there's some balance to that, because it's 4 out of 16, so 1/4. And for tier 1, you also have other tiers, right? And then for the sage, it's 3 out of 12. Yes. So it's the same. It's 1/4. And they're a little bit more powerful because they're mostly magical. So it kind of makes sense. There's a balancer for that. So then, after you've figured out the type of character and you've decided to, do all of those things and write all that stuff down on your character sheet, you then go back to the descriptor. And that defines the character and flavors everything they do. There's like 40 descriptors in the book, and each comes with modifications to your stat pool, skills that you're trained in, something that you're just completely bad at, the inability thing, sometimes equipment, sometimes not, and then it gives you some hooks on why you're with your party. If the descriptor doubles the skills that you already have from your type, then you get to increase it to this thing called specialized, which actually means that you can't learn any more of that. You're just really good at that thing. Having skill proficiency in this game is a matter of, if you have it, then you ease the difficulty down by 1. If you have specialized, you ease the difficulty down by 2, but that's the maximum amount your skills will ease anything. But it just makes you better at that. And each of these individual descriptors has an entire column of the page. The book is split into columns, right? So each page has 2 columns, an entire column for each of them. So that's what you get to look forward to choosing them, which means there's quite a bit of stuff in there, which is why character creation is so big. Then the focus, after you've chosen your descriptor, the focus is what makes the character unique. It helps connect them to their fellow PCs. It gives them a special ability or 2, sometimes additional equipment, offer suggestions on how to handle GM intrusions or how to do player intrusions, which is when the player inserts themselves in the story by spending some XP. But the intent is for it to help you describe how your character has sort of come out in the world and the kinds of things they do in the world, and help create your backstory and ties you to a place or a people or whatever to piece it all together. So that's kind of what it does. There's basically a page and a half for each of those. So there's not as many as there are for the descriptors, but they're all pretty cool. They're all really actually very cool. So let's just kind of describe it real fast. I know this video is already getting long. We're already at the longest video I've ever made. So let's just kind of break it down real fast. So if you were to make the charming preacher who serves the green, you'd start with your identifier as a speaker. The type, which is speaker. And so you start with speaker, and thus you're going to start with a might pool of 8, 9, or 11, might pool of 8, speed of 9, and intellect of 11. You're going to divide 6 points amongst those pools. You're going to start your effort tier 1. Your might edge, which is a thing that you use to decrease how much of your pool you spend when you try to do things. Your might edge is 0, your speed edge is 0, and your intellect edge is 1. So you're going to make it's going to be cheaper for you to spend effort with your intellect than it would be for your might or speed. You can have 2 ciphers at the same time. And then you have to choose your gear, which is 2 expensive items, 2 moderate items, and 4 inexpensive items, which is kind of the same for everybody. You get to choose 1 skill from a list that you are proficient in, that you are trained in. It's business, education, language, law, leadership, music, or religion. You are either trained, you choose whether you're either trained in magic or understanding magic, but you are unable to craft magic no matter which of those choices you make. So you can do magic, but you don't know how to make magical things, right? You're practiced with light weapons, so knives and stuff, but you are unable to use medium or heavy weapons. So that's where that comes in. Then you get to choose 4 of the 16 choices from the tier 1 abilities. And some of them cost your some pool points to activate, some of them don't. So the ones that I made or chose for this character was dialect, encouragement, shake the bones, and terrifying presence. Dialect means that he can pick up pick up languages whenever he's around them. Encouragement means it's kind of like bardic inspiration. Shake the bones is kind of like piercing wit. It's sort of this thing where you do damage by being clever and make fun of people. And then terrifying presence is essentially you scare the crap out of low-level monsters when they're near you by just being so, strong. But yeah, so that's basically the kind of thing. So now we've done that. Then we go charming, because I said that he was a charming preacher who serves the green. Charming, then he would gain 2 more in his intellect pool. He becomes trained in all of the social skills. He becomes really good at resisting seduction and persuasion. He has a contact of influence, but he's hindered by things that involve lore, knowledge, or understanding. He's not super great at remembering factual information for some reason. He's hindered also at resisting mental attacks. So something that attacks his mental abilities really kind of hits him harder. And he also gained a moderately priced item or the money equivalent thereof. And then serves a green. He gets to have a connection with a PC somewhere. There's a list of 4 options for how he's connected to one of the other PCs. He gains 3 more points that he can divide into his pools, which I divided into the pools, 1 for each. And then he's trained in wilderness navigation and identifying plants. So that's a new skill that he gained. So that's it. Now we have a character. He's fairly competent, fairly story-oriented, if you couldn't figure that out based on the way I was describing it. And that's basically the point of character creation, Old Gods of Appalachia. You're fighting evil and darkness as part of the story, but you should understand that your even low-level monsters are pretty dangerous, and you're going to be mostly exploring, but your low-level character is also pretty competent. So, check out the sheet. That's below. But let me talk some more. Character advancement is done through GM intrusions, and you gain XP for those intrusions. You gain XP for completing character arcs. You gain XP if you protect what matters, or you learn, knowing the unknowable, like you learn something or investigating weird stuff. You gain XP for finding artifacts, and you gain XP for role-playing. That's essentially what they are, and it's sort of handed out by the GM as necessary. But then you can use your XP in a bunch of different ways. You can spend XP. You can spend 1 XP as a player intrusion, where you insert yourself or something, into the story that you think would be beneficial. You can spend 1 XP to deny a GM intrusion. If a GM's like, I want to intrude here, you can say no. You can spend 1 XP to reroll a failure. You can spend 2 XP to temporarily gain training in a needed skill. You can also spend 2 XP to gain permanently a restricted skill, a specific skill. Like, for example, you have skill at fishing, but on this lake, right? So if you go to a different lake, you don't really know how to fish, but you can on this lake. You can spend 2 XP to cobble together some device that the group needs. You can spend 3 XP to gain a contact, build a home, create a job title, build a position in the community, or some other thing that you want to do for your character. And then you have the advancement options, where you're actually advancing your character toward the next tier. There's you would spend 4 XP on any of those things, and you have to do 4 of them before your character levels up, and that's how the tiers work in this game. It's called tiers. You can use 4 XP to put 4 XP into your pools. You can, and you have to do 4 at once. That's the sort of weird caveat. You can spend 4 XP to gain a +1 on the edge of your choice for one of your pools. You can increase your effort limit by 1 for 4 XP. You can advance a skill from like inability to trained to specialized. You can spend 4 XP to reduce the speed cost of wearing armor by 1, which is a thing. You can spend 4 XP to add 2 to your recovery rolls, +2 to your recovery rolls, so that you regain more as you go through. And you can spend 4 XP to basically get another ability. There's 2 kinds of ways to do that. It's not important, but basically you get another ability. That's how you level up in Old Gods of Appalachia. They're marked as tiers, and so as you check those boxes off of the things you spent 4 XP on, as you check 4 of them off, then you move up to the next tier. That's just how it goes. That grants you access to higher abilities or stuff, but they sort of assume that tiers are not always your best choice. As I said, maybe you actually just want to have a home or some status in a community, in which case you're going to use that for that kind of thing. Or maybe you just want to hoard it all and use it as necessary as the story goes. Maybe you want to be able to craft stuff on the fly, so you're going to keep a bunch of XP sort of hanging back there so you can craft necessary items as you need them. There is a crafting system, but it's just easier to spend an XP and just be like, oh yeah, I've got a lantern, or I cobbled together a bunch of things and now I have a flashlight. Totally useful. But that's how it's intended, and the Cypher system is sort of more of the gain the XP rather than level up. That's sort of a thing. But you can level up, and you do level up, and when you do, you get access to higher and more powerful abilities or things like that. But you can also take those level abilities and make them more powerful by putting effort into them, which is part of the game. So anyway, so the adventure, or the book also comes with 2 adventures, which is really helpful for new GMs like myself. And I really like that one of the adventures uses the What Wakes mode, which is the mode where GM intrusions start happening more and more frequently as you're going through a story, or as in an adventure or in a campaign. Because the What Wakes mode seems to be something new to Old Gods of Appalachia, and the idea being that some eldritch horror is starting to notice you, and therefore they start paying attention, so the GM starts intruding. As you're going through stuff and you're doing things and you're sort of getting yourself noticed, the GM intrudes more frequently, which is pretty cool. Overall, because we're already at 32 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and cut myself off, even though I've got things to talk about, like 20% of the book being world lore. Could have definitely had a lot more because the Old Gods of Appalachia have so much lore, and the book could have been bigger. I could talk about streamlining, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to go ahead and end it. Overall, I think that despite the Cypher system not being my favorite system, I'll set that aside to give it an honest review. Overall, I give it 1.5 thumbs. And the reason I give it 1.5 thumbs instead of 2 really has to do with that world lore and repetition thing. There's really just kind of a problem for me when you get a little confused by some of the stuff that's going on, and then you think, oh, I got it, but then you jump ahead and it sort of tells you something that feels contradictory but really isn't when you go back and read it. So the repeating thing is kind of annoying. But there was also some question about starting ciphers in the book as well, so you get repetitious things and then you don't have enough energy or enough information. I went to the community and other people seemed to be just as confused as I was, but then I eventually found the answer in the book where there should have been a repetition because it was kind of confusing. There wasn't. So it's kind of a weird thing. So I'm giving it 1.5 thumbs, right? 1.5 thumbs for me. Because, yeah, that's a little bit problematic. But overall, the book is very well done. The art is amazing. It's pretty decently organized, despite the repetition. Character creation is a little bit long-winded, but basically once you read through it the first time, you kind of understand what you're supposed to be doing. And so it's not really... a lot of it's for, as I level up, I go back to this section and figure out what new abilities I want or whatever. But if you wanted to play in the Old Gods of Appalachia world, the world made by Steve Shell and Cam Collins, this is a great game to do that. It gives you the ability to get all up involved in Appalachian folk magic and crazy things that are talked about on the podcast in that alternate world. It's not disappointing at all that they chose the Cypher system. In fact, it's kind of cool. I was a little disappointed to hear that they didn't create their own system, but having read the book, I actually think that the Cypher system works really well for what they were trying to do. The only thing I'm disappointed about is that I probably won't get a whole lot of friends to play this with me because of the Cypher System sort of weirdness. Some people don't actually like it that much, and so they probably won't play it. So that's the only disappointment I have. So go ahead and take that from me. My opinions are just my opinions, as you know. But go ahead and take that from me and decide whether or not you want to try to pre-order or buy. The book is not fully out yet. This is just the PDF, and so that's all I had to work with. But, whenever you see this, if you decide that you're going to get it, it's not a bad option. It's pretty much worth it. So it's going to be fun if you like the old Gods of Appalachia. So anyway, have good gaming, have good fun, and tell me how it goes.